Welcome, everyone, to this podcast introduction to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. My conversation with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, 10 things about Jefferson's first inaugural address. Fascinating. You know, she's not a great fan of Thomas Jefferson. That's not really fair, but she has some skepticism about Jefferson, as I do too. After the broadcast was finished, we kept talking, and I want you to listen to this because, I was out in the middle of nowhere in the American West, looked up at the television there on CNN, was none other than Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. So let's pick up the conversation right there. This is one of the great moments of my life. I was on this water trip, wandering around the American Southwest, and we wound up at this funky motel under a cliff, and we were tired, and we went in for dinner and got a good night of sleep. The next morning we're having breakfast before we go on our next part of our excursion, and I'm looking up at the television across the room, way across the room, and I said to Dennis, my friend, that woman who's on CNN looks a good deal like my friend Lindsay Chervinsky. And he said, and I said, I mean, look, and I said, it is Lindsay Chervinsky. It is Lindsay Chervinsky. And there you were. So explain how you got that gig.
Yeah, well, I'm a little bummed you didn't hear my voice first, because I would have really have loved to see your reaction of like hearing my voice and then being like, where is she? Why is she here? Yeah, you could never get away from me. So as part of my many multifaceted career, one of the things that I've been doing has been media commentary and providing quotes and resources and information for reporters when they call, providing feedback and expertise for different TV and radio channels. And I enjoy it a lot. It's fun. It's a different challenge. It's a different format. It's very different than podcasting because, of course, the visual part of it is so important. And the time limit is so different. You sort of are on, it's ticking, but it's fun. I really enjoy it. And so I've started to develop some relationships with producers at various stations. And when something comes up that's presidential history related, they will reach out and say, can you come and provide expertise on this story? And so I've done that for a bunch of different stations. What was going to be sort of like the diamond in the crown was I recorded on a panel with for Face the Nation with John Meacham, Richard Norton Smith, and Douglas Brinkley, and Bob Costa, who was filling in for Margaret Brennan. And that was supposed to run on Easter. And it was a great panel. We had a great conversation. And then it was preempted by the Masters. And I already had strong feelings about golf, but that did not help. The full clip of the full footage is available online, but it never ended up running, so I was pretty bummed about that. But this is something that I am hoping to do more of. It's fun, it's different, it's an interesting challenge, and I learn new things, and I feel like I get better each time I do it. I learn something about it each time I do it, and it's so fun. It's so weird to see like who has CNN on and will send me messages, and your email was definitely one of my favorites. I was so pleased about that.
Well, I'm watching. I don't know what you said because they had the sound turned off, and then Dennis he gets up out of our table and he walks under. He says, I think that is Lindsay Chervinsky. And you got a lot of time on that one. That was in CNN terms, that was eternity. So what were you talking about?
Yeah, so that slew of I did a slew of interviews after the Trump indictment, and talking about just sort of the historic nature of what that meant, and how we should think about it, and how we should put it in historic context, and have we been anywhere like this before. So I try really hard not to speak about the actual legal case, because I am not a lawyer, and B, I think it's inappropriate to comment on things before we have the evidence, but I'm happy to speak about whether or not we've ever been in a place close to this in terms of a president actually being indicted. And so that's what I try and offer.
So you were in your home or in a studio?
That particular one was in studio. I went into the DC bureau, and they have these little, it's interesting because I've done a bunch in my home, and then I've done one in the DC bureau, which was it's called a flash studio. And so it's basically like this closet where, it's soundproofed, and they have all this lighting set up, and they have a TV in front of you so you can see what things look like, and they have the camera. And then the Face the Nation one was a full set studio. And so that was fun. I was like, where am I supposed to put my hands? I did have to ask them. I was like, where do I put my hands, and which camera do I look at? Because there are so many of them. So these are just some of the fun new things that I get to do with my wacky and wild career.
So Easter Face the Nation with Douglas Brinkley, Richard Norton Smith, John Meacham. That's a pretty heavyweight group of historians.
Yeah, I was pretty pumped to be included in that. That was it was an honor to be among them.
I know two of them. Douglas Brinkley is a friend of mine, and Richard Norton Smith I've had some encounters with over the time. I've never met John Meacham. I won't ask you to rank them. I'd love to rank them myself, but I'm not going to, of course. But what a heady experience. And what were you talking about there?
So we did a presidential sort of history panel, and it was looking at the challenges facing President Biden and putting them in context with past challenges facing the president and what we should think about in terms of, how history might guide us going forward. So one of the questions that I answered was, that we've seen a rise of nationalism, and what does that mean both domestically and internationally, and what should we sort of think about that, and what were some of the parallels? And it was a very wide-reaching, far-ranging conversation.
Amazing. So I will go see it, and I urge our listeners to watch it. So we'll probably lose you to major media here shortly, once this phone starts ringing, and now that thanks to the pandemic, you can broadcast from home. I always used to think, poor Doug Brinkley, he's on the plane every single day getting to a studio, but now not necessarily so.
It does make it easier. The advent of technology has certainly made some of these hits more accessible. But no, I will continue to be an avid Thomas Jefferson and Listening to America person, because the audience, not only are they so in tune, but they also watch CNN. I got a lot of messages from listeners, which was delightful of them. And I have yet to go to an event where someone has not mentioned that they are a listener, and they are always my favorite interactions. So keep them coming.
So that's all good news. We'll hope that we can keep you in the face of what appears to be greater and greater celebrity. Well deserved, and congratulations. And I know how tough that is, because I've done some major television, and of course I've done all these Ken Burns films, and you feel all alone in the universe, especially when you're at home and you can't even see what's going on, and then they say go, and that, and maybe the producer says, no, we only got 22 seconds, so tell the story of the Civil War in 22 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the hardest parts to get used to, was the fact that, especially when you're at home, you'll have the audio in your ear. And sometimes if you're lucky, you'll see the host, but often you just see a black box. And so it's really hard to be natural and engaging when you can't see the person you're talking to. You're staring at a black box. You're listening carefully for okay, you're live. It is a challenge.
Well, of all the places I would have thought I might have a Lindsay Chervinsky encounter, Marble Canyon of the Colorado River Basin was not one of them. And it lit up our day, and I think in terms, it lit up yours in a certain way. So thank you. So I do think we're likely to lose Lindsay Chervinsky to major media. She's a rising star. And once you crack that nut of getting calls from CNN and MSNBC and so on, unless you screw up, or unless the world changes, that's going to lead to greater and greater things, because television remains the most visible thing we do as a people. So we're lucky to have her. We'll keep talking. She's been an absolute delight for this program and brought fresh intelligence to it in ways that are really good and important. So now let's go to the program. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, soon to be Listening to America. And across from me, at least virtually, is my friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, the author of an important book on George Washington's cabinet. Today, 10 things about Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address. Jefferson delivered his first inaugural address in the unfinished Capitol building in Washington, D.C. on March 4th, 1801. It was almost inaudible, but it turned out to be one of the finest inaugural addresses in American history. So, Lindsay, let's start with inaudible. Your man Washington, and Jefferson too, had this kind of thing about not speaking too loudly. They were gentlemen. They affected, I think, to be nervous and uncertain as public orators. They didn't want to be Patrick Henry for some reason, or even John Adams. What's that about? I mean, Jefferson actually had a weak voice, but Washington, too, had that kind of shy inaudibility.
Well, I think they came at it from different perspectives. So there is a lot of evidence to suggest that during the war, Washington was quite loud. His voice could carry when he wanted it to. And he was especially loud when he was angry.
When he's mad.
Yeah, there are moments when he absolutely lost his temper. And, when he shouted, everyone heard him. I think in formal settings like the inauguration, there are probably two things that contributed to perhaps a quieter voice. One was he did not have Jefferson's education. He did not have Adams' education. He did not have Madison's education. And he was self-conscious about his lack of formal training. Now, he tried to, of course, supplement that to the best of his abilities with his own course of self-education. And the words that he had written, at least for the first inauguration, were largely crafted by Madison. So he could rely that they were, excellent prose. But I think there was an insecurity about his own delivery, his own sort of ability to rise to that moment. The second thing is he didn't have teeth. So he had dentures, and they were, very rudimentary and
loose. They were always floating around in his
yeah,
mouth.
And so I think he was a poor speaker because it was really hard to talk, and his mouth often really hurt. I don't think Jefferson has that excuse. I think that Washington had these real reasons why speaking was hard for him, although reports from the time did suggest that at least people near him could hear him. So he wasn't whispering. He just wasn't a great orator like some of the other contemporaries at that time.
They didn't have the adhesives for the dentures at the time, so his dentures were on springs. Every time he relaxed his mouth would open up, and they didn't fit right. And the subject of Washington's dentures is a whole monograph, really, for somebody. But Jefferson kept his teeth because he had proper dental hygiene. But I think in Jefferson's case, it was more an affectation. He never shouted. I'm guessing he probably never shouted in the whole course of his life. Or maybe there was one instance when he and his daughter were on a ferry crossing the Potomac and things went badly wrong and Jefferson really got upset. Normally, Jefferson had that kind of stoic calm. But I think he felt if he could really belt out a speech that somehow that would diminish him as an exquisite man of the Enlightenment and so on. I think Washington didn't quite feel that.
No, I think Washington had no problem feeling as though he was a strong presence. I think that was something he cultivated, and he didn't mind being louder. I do think Jefferson's conception of masculinity and Republican virtue, and again, this is little r Republican virtue, called for a quieter, softer version of presentation.
Yeah, masculinity, his concept of masculinity, and then small r Republican virtue. You see that at least 3 times in it, he says, effectively, I'm not sure I'm really worthy of being the president of the United States. 3 times. I mean, he goes way out of his way to say this, to be the first officer of a republic is such an extraordinary thing that I don't know if I have the right stuff. You gag at that.
Yeah, listeners, I'm rolling my eyes. I do think that a certain sense of humility coming into this office is appropriate and required, and we have seen over the course of American history that humanity is rarely up to the task because it is such an enormous job, and so presidents should be humble about their abilities in the face of this office. And so I don't feel like, I think the 3 mentions is maybe a little much, and is certainly the expectation of politics at the time that politicians will present themselves as unworthy and unwilling and being called to service. But I think that Jefferson, in his heart of hearts, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think he absolutely believed he was qualified to be president. I think he absolutely believed he should be president, and thought that there was probably no one better suited for the job at the moment.
Well, first of all, there's the trope of Cincinnatus, that you're really just a quiet farmer and you've been called into this office. And yes, of course, you'll try to do the best that you can. But You're pretty well aware of your inadequacies. I think that's required. I think Jefferson also felt he was maybe a little too old. His health was not great at this time. He had a kind of irritable bowel syndrome of some sort and migraine headaches. I also think he was so sensitive to criticism that he's essentially saying, I'm probably going to get beaten up. I'm probably going to be vilified. So in other words, it's partly about his fear of his enemies attacking him as president.
Well, that's certainly rational. And I think that a lot of the politicians at the time, and I think politicians today also are aware of that and fear that. And I don't blame them. And I think that's a big reason that a lot of people don't want to run for office.
I'm asking you to read certain sections of this. We'll be able to do it in the course of this hour. And the first one is his first expression of inadequacy. So here we go with the beginning of Jefferson's first inaugural address by Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky.
Called upon to undertake the duties of the first executive office of our country, I avail myself of the presence of that portion of my fellow citizens which is here assembled to express my grateful thanks for the favor with which they have been pleased to look toward me, to declare a sincere consciousness that the task is above my talents, and that I approach it with those anxious and awful presentiments which the greatness of the charge and the weakness of my powers so justly inspire.
So there's where you roll your eyes, that the task is above my talents. If anyone was talented enough to administer a small little agrarian country, it was certainly Thomas Jefferson.
It's also not exactly an inspiring way to start. Just as a writer note, as a small editorial, comment.
Oh, great. So Lindsay is now correcting the prose of one of the finest inaugural addresses.
Not the prose, just the way in which he's chosen to organize. Maybe a different sentiment to begin.
So just a few details in our 10 things about Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address. He walked to his inaugural.
One of the ways with which Jefferson chose to distinguish himself from the people that came before him was he was staying at a boarding house on Capitol Hill prior to his inauguration.
Conrad's.
Yes, Conrad and McMunn. He had breakfast that morning with everyone else that was at the boarding house. They offered him the head of the table. He declined, chose to have as simple of a presentation as possible, and then he walked to the Capitol. Now, he was escorted by a lot of officers, by cabinet secretaries, by militia, bands, etc. But in doing so, he drew a distinction between Adams, who had a small carriage, and then Washington, who had his very elegant carriage.
For Washington, big ceremony. For Adams, some ceremony.
Yes, and so Jefferson wanted no ceremony.
And Jefferson is, again, a small R Republican, wanting to bring down the ceremonial temperature to make sure people know that he's the first officer, but he's not the king. And he felt that both of his predecessors had sort of erred on the side of monarchical trappings and accoutrements. So Jefferson not only walks, but he doesn't carry a ceremonial sword. He wears plain gentleman's clothing. This is political theater, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, and they all attempted a form of political theater. So, for example, when Adams was selecting his outfits, he selected a pearl gray velvet suit because Washington was known at this point for wearing a black velvet suit. So he was trying to distinguish sort of the color that he was known for. And Jefferson was known for usually wearing navy or a blue suit. And so they all were choosing these details very carefully to present a certain image that both tried to suggest the values with which they were hoping to lead, but also to draw a distinction between those that came before them.
But Thomas Jefferson believed that we were engaging in an unprecedented experiment in self-government, that this was a kind of utopian moment in human history, and that it was really important to get it right. And so it's theater, but it's also a philosophical statement about the nature of America, right?
It is. And I think that the presentation and the values that he's trying to present as the philosophical statement of America that you're suggesting is something that we still grapple with. It's when you're forming something new, you're not only forming it in juxtaposition to what has come before, so in comparison to a monarchy, but you're trying to craft something from scratch, and that's really hard and should, I think, evolve over time to resemble the society and what it stands for.
I think if John Adams had been there, and as you know, he skulked out of Washington at dawn on the public stage, not wishing to be there to see the torch passed to Mr. Jefferson, his old friend and rival. If John Adams had been there, he would have certainly behaved like a gentleman, but I think he would have inwardly rolled his eyes a little at this theater. I think he would have said, all right, we get it. You're breaking with us, that Washington and I are regarded as monarchical, but you're laying it on a little thick.
I think he thought that about a lot of things Jefferson did.
You've heard me talk before about the Jefferson music. I use that as a phrase, and I think you agree that if any one of the founders knew how to really sing the song of America, it was Thomas Jefferson. So then right after that little self-depreciating start, he says, a rising nation spread over a wide and fruitful land, traversing all the seas with the rich productions of their industry, engaged in commerce with nations who feel power and forget right, advancing rapidly to destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye. And then another apology. When I contemplate these transcendent objects and see the honor, the happiness, and the hopes of this beloved country committed to the issue and the auspices of this day, I shrink from the contemplation and humble myself before the magnitude of the undertaking. Very beautiful. A second disclaimer of his talents. What an evocation of America, right?
Oh, absolutely. And while there are a lot of things that Jefferson does in this inauguration that are different than the people that came before him or the people that came after him, the proclamation of the beauty and the potential of the nation and the hope and the prayer that, that not a religious prayer, but a symbolic prayer for what the nation can be is a consistent theme through almost all inaugural addresses.
We need to take a short break. We're talking about 10 things with respect to Jefferson's first inaugural address. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky is my special guest. We'll be back in just a moment. You are listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. 10 things about Jefferson's first inaugural address. Lindsay, just off the top of your head, where would you rank it in the history of inaugural addresses? I would put it in the top 5, certainly.
Definitely in the top 5. I think that it's almost impossible to place anything first other than Lincoln's second inaugural, but I certainly think that this is up there, and partly because of what it stood for and the moment it stood for in terms of all of the importance of the transfer of power and the peaceful transition and all of those things and the historic nature of it. And then, of course, the line, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," is, I think, an essential contribution to American political thought.
And, of course, your man Washington sort of gave 1.5 inaugural addresses, but I love the second one, and it was also almost identical with Franklin Roosevelt's fourth, in which they say, if you don't know me by now, I got nothing more to say here. You know who I am. Let's get on with it.
Yeah, it's, I really admire when politicians have the opportunity to say a lot and they choose not to. I think brevity is a kind of a lost art in politics. His first inaugural was not particularly long either. He basically says, I know the Constitution calls upon me to make recommendations to you, but I haven't really been in office, so why don't I get back to you on that? Which I think is amazing. So I think that brevity is, as I said, it's a lost art.
So those are two of the shortest, Washington's second and Roosevelt's fourth. But Lincoln at 700 or 702 words, second inaugural address, one of the finest pieces of American writing. Forget presidential inaugural addresses. If you had to put one or two things in a time capsule to say, what is America, you would want the second inaugural address, certainly.
Wow, he gets, the second inaugural and the Emancipation Proclamation
and Gettysburg Address.
The Gettysburg Address, and boy, did he know how to write, like the peak of American rhetoric.
So, Lindsay, back to our 10 things about this extraordinary inaugural address by Thomas Jefferson. We're agreeing it's top 5. Adams chooses not to be present. Unpack that for us.
This moment is a little bit more complex than people like to suggest in history books. It makes for a good joke, and because Adams did tend towards crotchety, it makes for an easy joke. He was bitter about the loss. He was resentful about the way Americans regarded his service. He was also mourning the death of his son. His son Charles had died just a few months prior, and he was in a bad place. So there's no doubt about that. However, I do think it's a bit more nuanced than we sometimes suggest, because in the United States, there was not a tradition of a defeated person showing up to the inauguration. There was not necessarily even a tradition of the incumbent showing up, the predecessor showing up. And so when Washington did for Adams' inauguration, there was a lot of surprise that he was there, which suggests that there was not this tradition and there was not this expectation that he would be there. And I think that Adams did actually have a real concern that his presence would be a distraction, that it would make it into a circus, that it would detract from the moving on spirit that he had wanted to convey. And one of the things that I write about in this book on Adams that I'm wrapping up is that both he and Jefferson went to great lengths to actually try and make the transition as smooth as possible and as friendly as possible. And people don't write about this, but they exchanged a lot of letters. They had visits. Adams lent him sort of secretaries and encouraged his cabinet secretaries to stay on to help Jefferson. He wrote letters once he got back to Jefferson to kind of check in and see how things were going. And Jefferson, of course, contributed to this as well. And so I think that spirit of not being sure how it would go did absolutely contribute to the decision. I do think that is part of it and should not be overlooked.
Adams writes a letter to Jefferson saying, oh, there are the horses. You can have the horses and there's the carriage. I mean, I don't know what you want to do about all that, but, I left them behind for you. And it's not like an enemy. He's not resisting. But you could even make the case that Adams withdrawing is a small R Republican gesture, too. Like, I've had my time. I now leave it to you. I don't want to get in the way. We love to make the gag that he was so peevish that he wouldn't come. But maybe it's, as you say, can be seen more generously than that. He does mention our illustrious first president. That's, I suppose, automatic. That has to happen. But he doesn't mention the second president.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that is trying to move past the political rancor of the moment, there was no doubt that Jefferson obviously disagreed with a whole lot that happened during the Adams administration and how much was trying to sort of put Washington in the pantheon of sort of a unanimous figure and a non-political figure. And of course, Washington had died at this point. So he had, ascended into the holiness of the other and was very much treated as some sort of like holy being as opposed to a normal politician or president.
You can see the arch Federalists going out for a cup of grog after this speech and thinking, pretty rich coming from Jefferson. I mean, he trashed Washington. He undercut his administration. Jefferson was not a loyal person in the Washington administration. Now here he is laying out this sort of, the illustrious first character. I think some people probably gagged over that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's no doubt that it's kind of hypocritical in that Jefferson referred to Washington when it was useful for him, but then also was very quick to criticize when he disagreed.
So, Lindsay, we better move back into the inaugural address if we're going to finish it. Give us the next paragraph.
Utterly indeed, should I despair, did not the presence of many whom I here see remind me that in the other high authorities provided by our Constitution, I shall find resources of wisdom, of virtue, and of zeal, on which to rely under all difficulties. To you, then, gentlemen, who are charged with the sovereign functions of legislation, and to those associated with you, I look with encouragement for that guidance and support which may enable us to steer with safety the vessel in which we are all embarked amidst the conflicting elements of a troubled world.
Two things there. One is Jefferson's acknowledging legislative supremacy. That was his theory, that of the three branches, the legislature was the one closest to the people, and therefore we bow to it and their greater wisdom. Fair enough. But then he uses his trope. Jefferson is not a man who uses a lot of figurative language, but he has one that he repeats over and over and over and over until it's just ad nauseum. And that's one of the great cliches, the ship of state. So here he says, our vessel in which we are embarked. I've made a list of these, Lindsay. There are hundreds of them in Jefferson. And the thing is, he was only at sea once, and he was a poor sailor. He didn't enjoy sea travel. He got sick. Jefferson, somehow, his prose is remarkably lucid, more lucid, I think, than any other of the founders, and very, very little figurative language, very few metaphors and similes and tropes and so on. But the one that he can't let go is the ship of state, and here it is.
Well, it just lends to so many excellent, choppy waters and storms and winds and forces and gales and, there's just so much there.
Finally at port after our argosy has been racked by, that sort of thing.
And there's a captain and there's a crew and there's all of these things. It's just so useful.
I'll start with this next one because I want you to get the great one. During the contest of opinion through which we have passed, the animation of discussions and of exertions has sometimes worn an aspect which might impose on strangers unused to think freely and to speak and to write what they think. But this now being decided by the voice of the nation, announced according to the rules of the Constitution, all will of course arrange themselves under the will of the law and unite in common efforts for the common good. So it's been a really rugged election. 36 ballots in the House of Representatives. The Federalists try to deny Jefferson his office. There's a lot of craziness. It's one of the most contested elections in early American history. And Jefferson is basically saying two things. The election is over. Deal with it. I'm president. Nobody else is. And he's saying that the Constitution held up, which it did, because some of the more ardent Federalists really wanted to deny Jefferson the presidency, and his view was, look, people in a republic have ways of solving these things without violence, and look what happened. I'm now the president. We have to put that behind us.
Absolutely. And I think this is perhaps one of the most important contributions because it establishes or reaffirms the concept that in a democracy or a republic, you settle your differences at the ballot box, and then you accept that outcome. And all parties move forward with the understanding that you will have the opportunity to again settle differences in a set period of time. And so Jefferson sets the expectation that all presidents, therefore, going forward, will continue to abide by that base rule. And even presidents that we've had trouble with in the past, like Nixon, have abided by that rule, even when they had maybe reason to be uncomfortable with it. And so I think that that contribution, that cornerstone of the American system is so essential.
Through the whole course of American history, this paragraph has defined the way we do things. The gravity of this can best be seen by a historian like yourself who knows what's at stake. How many times in American history there have been heavily contested elections when there's an enormous amount of political and social tension in the country, and yet this transfer of power has characterized our system, and you would think that nobody, under any circumstances, would ever mess with that.
The concept of this paragraph is that the Constitution and the electoral system is bigger than any one person. Matters more than any one person, matters more than any political party, because it is supposed to be for a duration that outlives us all. All politicians, even if they had reason sometimes to be uncomfortable. Nixon certainly had reason to be uncomfortable. Samuel Tilden certainly had reasons to be uncomfortable. Al Gore, and they all said no. They said, this is way more important than me and my political ambitions and my presidency and my political party.
All right, so now we come to one of the greatest passages in American political discourse, and you get to read it.
It's very kind of you to let me read it. I hope I can do Jefferson's words a little bit of justice.
Stumble over your words and have a wispy voice and be too gentlemanly to do it.
Definitely not going to do that, but I will do my best. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. And let us reflect that having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance a political intolerance as despotic, as wicked, as capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions. During the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, during the agonizing spasms of infuriated men, seeking through blood and slaughter his long-lost liberty, it was not wonderful that the agitation of the billows should reach even this distant and peaceful shore, that this should be more felt and feared by some and less by others, and should divide opinions as to measures of safety. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists.
What can you say to that?
It's so good. It's so good.
One of the 3 or 4 best things Jefferson ever wrote.
I think the line that often doesn't get credit but deserves it is, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. That matters so much because what he's saying is that we can disagree and we're not enemies. We can disagree and we're all still Americans. That's so important and so essential to a nation that is going to have differences of opinion, is going to have different perspectives, but should remain under the American auspice. And that should be the most important identifying part of our identity.
Do you think he meant it?
That's a good question.
I loved your broad smile on that one. I don't want us to be cynical. I think this is magnificent, but there's at least some question about whether he really thought we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans.
Yeah, I don't want to be cynical because it is such a glorious paragraph. But if you read the things that he was writing in private in 1798 and 1799, it's hard to then think that he actually really meant it, because he was so angry and he hated so much what the Federalists were doing, or at least some of the Federalists. And he did draw with a broad brush. And so I don't know that he meant it.
I think he means it in the usual Jeffersonian sense, that when he envisions the ideal world, this is how it looks. And the world he happens to live in is not quite the ideal world, but we won't get there unless we articulate that vision of harmony and so on. But here's the sentence that really works best for me in that. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection, without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. That's Jefferson. That's not Washington. That's not Adams. That's not Woodrow Wilson. That's not Theodore Roosevelt. Jefferson was a harmony obsessive. He couldn't stand rancor and conflict and egos jostling in the public square. He shrank from all of that in a way that bothered some people, I think. But this he really meant, that life is dreary if life is conflict. We have to restore harmony. We have to get along. We have to paper over our differences. We have to be civil. We have to be polite. We can't let ourselves be spiral down into a world of rancor and mutual distrust.
I think that was a weakness of his. I think that if you can't live in a place where there is conflict, there's sometimes reason for conflict, and there are good things that can come out of it. And I think that his desire to promote harmony above all was, for him, a vice.
I think that he didn't have the right stuff to be a power politician. It's like LBJ duking it out with his friends and enemies in the Senate. There's a little Barack Obama in this, that unwillingness to engage in the really ugly, hugger-mugger, conflict-driven world of hard politics. That's where it is. That's where republics work things out, because we're not killing each other with AR-15s. We're duking it out in debate. That's what we have to do. And Jefferson's kind of ethereal harmony obsession he's not fighting fair, because he always leaves the room.
No, I think that that's right. And I think that it worked for him when he had people who could then fight on his behalf and get stuff done, because stuff does get done in that messy, brawling, muddy sort of way. Legislative process, if you're going to have a legislative process, is going to require compromise and require that sort of dealing that he was uncomfortable with. So as long as there were other people that could do it for him, it was fine-ish. It just, when it came especially to like his own personal affairs, there was no one else to do that. And so I think that that's where the always leaving the room is a problem.
He also makes a reference to the French Revolution. So the ancient world, the spasms of infuriated man, what he's basically saying, I think, Lindsay, is that, look, we get it. The French Revolution washed over into America and really screwed things up and made for some awful, awful years. Thank goodness that wave has passed.
Yeah, and I think he was, in alluding to this, he's trying to distinguish. There was a real concern among a lot of Americans, especially the Federalists, that there was this radical force that had come over from France and from Haiti that was going to bring revolution and anarchy in the same way that they had seen, and therefore bring extraordinary violence and destruction. And at times, there appeared to be a relationship, or at least some sort of working nub, between the Republican Party and those forces. And so Jefferson is trying to draw a distinction between his version of the Republican Party and what he is trying to do, and separate it from that violence and that anarchy that was so feared.
I think it's almost an apology. He's basically saying the French Revolution just created a tsunami of disruption in the world, including here. We were all drawn into it. It's over now. Thank goodness. I think he realizes, as you say, that his party cozied up to the French Revolution in ways that increased the disruption. We need to take a short break, but before we do, I want to read what is maybe the next greatest passage in the first inaugural address, "If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, small r Republican, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. I know indeed that some honest men fear that a republican government cannot be strong, that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot, in the full tide of successful experiment, abandon the government which has so far kept us free and firm on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may by possibility want energy to preserve itself? I trust not." So, that's a beautiful argument to say, I know a lot of people think that a democratic republic like ours just can't work. But the fact is, it got us through the war. We beat the world's greatest power. We've survived against all the odds. All the predictions that we would collapse have proved to be wrong. This thing is strong. I'll ask you more about it when we come back from our break. We're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky and I are talking about 10 things in Jefferson's first inaugural address. Lindsay, I ended the previous segment by quoting that great passage of Jefferson saying, "Whatever you think are the weaknesses of a republic, it's way stronger than you have thought."
And I think he was relying on two additional principles. So one of the things that holds together a nation is its shared history, its shared past, its reluctance to depart from something that they have had for a long time. So that's one of the reasons that we treasure the Constitution is it's been around for a really long time. And the longer it lives, the more it takes on this emotional, spiritual, and symbolic value to the nation. By the time Jefferson is coming into office, the Constitution and the nation has really only been in operation for about 11 years. And so that's not a very long time, but it's 11 years more than it had. And so he's trying to sort of build on this existence to say, like, we're going to continue to build on this history. And the more that it is there, the more elections that it survives, the more crises that it survives, the more likely it is to survive in the future. We as humans think that things, if something hasn't happened before, if a republic hasn't survived before, that means that it won't survive until it does. So like everything, all solutions don't work until they do. And so he is willing to put his faith that this solution maybe is the one that will work. It's like, was it Edison who said that he had come up with 100 different ways to not build a light bulb until you find one that does? And so Jefferson is saying that all of these republics haven't worked, but maybe this is the version of the republic that actually works.
And of course, he's also saying the fact that I was elected president proves that this works. Right? I mean, truly, because he's saying, look, we've been through this really wild last decade of craziness and everyone's at each other's throats, and there were militias forming during the election crisis of 1801, and a lot of us thought this thing might collapse. But the fact that this country could then make me its president, a mild, philosophical farmer, proves that we can survive these storms.
And more specifically, the fact that he was the person that was intended as the Republican presidential candidate and then actually came into office proved that if you give the democratic process a chance, the intended outcome would succeed.
So read the next passage, which is another one of the greatest hits of the first inaugural address.
I believe this, on the contrary, the strongest government on earth. I believe it the only one where every man at the call of the law would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he, then, be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the forms of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question.
Fabulous. Some people think that humans are not up to it. So what, you're going to choose some guardians to do it on your, and of course behind his little sentence there's, do you want Hamilton to run the thing? You want a power politician? Do you want a monarchical figure? He's with Winston Churchill. Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government except for every other one. Jefferson is saying, yeah, you can have some doubts about self-government, but what's the alternative?
It is both a statement of extreme pessimism about humanity if you put power in the hands of one person, but also a statement of extreme optimism of humanity if you put it collectively, which I think is interesting because it comes at it from such different angles.
I think that the phrasing here is as important as the sentiment. Jefferson is a prose-style genius, and sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the forms of kings to govern him? Fabulous. Just so well written. Madison is the one who said in the Federalists, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So there may be a little riff on that here too.
A lot of times great writing borrows on the ideas of others, or we stand on the shoulders of the great rhetoricians or prose stylists that have come before us. And he certainly borrows from Madison's ideas, just as Madison borrowed from him.
Madison was no Jefferson, let's put it that way. So I'll read this next one. It's a little bit long, but at some point in an inaugural address, you have to sort of say what you're going to do or what your plan is. Let us then, with courage and confidence, pursue our own federal and republican principles, our attachment to union and representative government. And now this, another piece of the Jefferson music, kindly separated by nature and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc of one quarter of the globe, too high-minded to endure the degradations of the others, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the thousandth and the thousandth generation, entertaining a due sense of our equal right to the use of our own faculties, to the acquisitions of our own industry, to honor and confidence from our fellow citizens, resulting not from birth, but from our actions and their sense of them, enlightened by a benign religion, professed indeed and practiced in various forms, yet all of them inculcating honesty, truth, temperance, gratitude, and the love of man, acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence, which by all its dispensations proves that it delights in the happiness of man here and his greater happiness hereafter. I'll give to you the next piece.
With all these blessings, what more is necessary to make us a happy and a prosperous people? Still one thing more, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities.
It's so magnificent because, it's a libertarian manifesto. Just all the government's just a little umpire. It's just a mild-mannered little umpire. We don't take anyone's tax money unless we absolutely have to. There's almost no regulation. People are living their quiet, beautiful lives. And maybe from time to time, government needs to call a foul or step in to adjudicate a dispute. He says, acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence, which by all its dispensation proves that it delights in the happiness of man and his greater happiness hereafter. So he doesn't say God, but he's as close as Jefferson's ever going to get to saying God.
This is another point that comes up again and again in almost all presidential addresses is, although we as a nation have pretty strict rules about the separation of church and state, we also have certain expectations of the faith and the religious lives of our leaders. And those, of course, have changed and evolved over time, but Jefferson was keenly aware that Americans were wary of his religious life, and it had been a feature in the election. It continues to be a feature in our elections. And so the first three presidents all include some mention, especially at the end. They usually include some call to a higher power, and Jefferson is the same. He often uses these calls to what one might think of as some sort of higher protector that gives a lot of space for people to interpret it however they are most comfortable doing so.
All right, so let's move forward. I want to co-read this paragraph with you. He's now going to lay out his program. This is what I stand for. Equal and exact justice to all men of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political.
Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, the support of the state governments in all their rights as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns, and the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies.
The preservation of the general government in its whole constitutional vigor as the sheet anchor, another ship metaphor, is the sheet anchor of our peace at home and safety abroad.
A jealous care of the right of election by the people, a mild and safe corrective of abuses which are lopped by the sword of revolution where peaceful remedies are unprovided.
Absolute acquiescence in the decisions of the majority, the vital principle of republics from which is no appeal but to force, the vital principle and immediate parent of despotism.
A well-disciplined militia, our best reliance in peace and for the first moments of war till regulars may relieve them.
The supremacy of the civil over the military authority.
Economy in the public expense, that labor may be lightly burdened.
The honest payment of our debts and the sacred preservation of the public faith.
Encouragement of agriculture and of commerce as its handmaid.
The diffusion of information and arraignment of all abuses at the bar of the public reason.
Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of person under protection of the habeas corpus, and trial by juries impartially selected.
And then he concludes, these principles form the bright constellation which has gone before us and guided our steps through an age of revolution and reformation. So, Lindsay, an amazing litany there. But what he says that really struck me in reading it this week to prepare for our conversation was a jealous care of the right of election by the people. His view is, we have got to settle our disputes in this republic at the ballot box. That we have to protect that.
Absolutely. And what I like about this section is that on one hand, it is very finely tuned to the battles of the 1790s. So many of these phrases are explicit rejections of Federalist principles or policies or legislation. And so many are explicit principles that the Republicans ran on. And yet a lot of them are also timeless. So paying off our debts is something that is going to be in the news a lot in the next couple of months. Freedom of the press is something that's essential. Trial by juries, supremacy of the civil over military authority. These are things that come up time and time again. So, it is both a very specific political statement about the moment, but also a timeless one.
These are the ideals of a free society. And he states them with such confidence here and such clarity that he's basically saying, who can disagree with this set of principles?
Yeah, he phrases it in such a way that makes it really hard to disagree with. Really, really, really difficult to say that he's wrong.
It's amazing. And he says, entangling alliances with none, a phrase often attributed to your man Washington.
This is true. Now, the principle I do think applies and was a principle that was shared by, I think, a lot of the founding generation. Not all, but certainly a lot of them. Washington, Adams, and Jefferson all agreed that neutrality was essential, but the phrase was Jefferson's.
Extraordinary piece of work. So then let's go to the end here, and you read it, please. I repair then,
fellow citizens, to the post you have assigned me. With experience enough in subordinate offices to have seen the difficulties of this the greatest of all, I have learnt to expect that it will rarely fall to the lot of imperfect men to retire from this station with the reputation and the favor which bring him into it, without pretensions to that high confidence you reposed in our first and greatest revolutionary character, whose preeminent services had entitled him to the first place in his country's love and destined for him the fairest page in the volume of faithful history. I ask so much confidence only as may give firmness and effect to the legal administration of your affairs.
A great moment of praise for the father of the country, George Washington. But what I love are two other passages here. First of all, I repair then to the post you have assigned to me. Oh, I thought you ran for the presidency and attacked your political enemies and undercut John Adams.
Yeah, he worked darn hard for that post. This was not something that was a surprise in any way to him.
What? You want me to be president? I'd rather be farming. So a wonderful thing to say for Jefferson. But then he said something that you surely must agree is the absolute truth. I've learned to expect that it will rarely fall to the lot of imperfect man to retire from this station with the reputation and the favor which bring him into it. That characterizes most presidencies.
It's true, and it also parallels Washington expressed these same concerns as he was coming into office, both privately and publicly. Most presidents have this experience. There are a few presidents that leave office with the same sort of approval as they have coming into it. And now maybe they might gain it later as history sort of reconsiders their interpretation of them, but most presidents go out more unpopular than they do come in.
Absolutely. It's a very wise thing that Jefferson understood. His third apology, his third self-depreciative statement in the course of this inaugural address. But also, when you look at like the photographs today of presidents before and after their presidency, they've aged like 35 years. I remember seeing Barack Obama photograph when he left, and he's gray and grizzled, and he's got some wear on the tires. And you and I probably have no way to understand the pressure of being the president of the United States.
No, it's impossible. I mean, and I think it was maybe actually Obama who said this, that there are no easy decisions that get to the president's desk because the easy decisions are taken care of long before they reach the Oval Office. And so if you're doing the presidency right, or even if you are doing it to the best of your ability and with a good faith effort, you are working incredible hours. You are never really off because even when you're on vacation, you have to be aware of certain things.
Every presidential act immediately has a barrage of pushback and vilification and cynicism and undermining and deliberate misrepresentation. No matter what, you wonder why any human being would be willing to do this. We're almost out of time. I just want to read one more. I shall often go wrong through defective judgment. When right, I shall often be thought wrong by those whose positions will not command a view of the whole ground. I ask your indulgence for my own errors, which will never be intentional, and your support against the errors of others who may condemn what they would not if seen in all of its parts. Absolutely. Great wisdom there. But again, that kind of anxiety. So, all right, thank you for helping me read this. I think most of our listeners have never actually sat down to read Jefferson's first inaugural address, and I think it's worth spending some time with because he has 6 or 7 world-class moments here that define the presidency of the United States, not just his 8 years as president.
Even for historians who often read these things, we often don't say them aloud. And I do think that there is interesting understanding and comprehension and emphasis that we gain when we actually speak the words, especially if something was intended to be spoken.
I think it's important to do. I agree with you. And I also think that you need to read it in its entirety because, Jefferson, we know this much. He worked on this. This was not a throwaway piece. This is not a transcript of something he said into a tape recorder. Jefferson really, really worked hard at this because he knew he'd been through a very deeply contested election, that there were many, many honest people that thought he was a disaster, that the country might not survive a Jefferson presidency, and there were others who deliberately wanted to make his presidency fail, that he had enemies, and that his atheism or his supposed atheism was an issue. His Frenchification during those years that he was the American minister in France had made him suspect. His embrace of the French Revolution, and the partisanship with which he showed both as the Secretary of State within Washington's administration and as the Vice President of the United States. We like to sometimes vilify his enemies, but some of his enemies were good and decent patriotic men and women who had sincere doubts about a Jefferson presidency, and he did everything in his power here to calm those waters.
That's right. And I think, we often look back on the concerns that people had with the benefit of hindsight, and we think that they were foolish, but people did have concerns that Jefferson would destroy the financial system, which would destroy the economy that had just really started to kind of get its foothold again in the international world. And those contributions in the national credit and the economy and the banking system, they were really important. And I think that they would have been right that if Jefferson had destroyed that, it would have been hugely detrimental to the nation. And so credit goes to Jefferson for understanding that even if he didn't necessarily support these measures, they were beneficial and he kept them in place.
I'm amazed at how generous you were to the third president of the United States today. We're out of time. We'll be back with Lindsay Chervinsky in a few weeks. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.